The signal arrived without ceremony. No alarms, no cascade of warnings, just a quiet distortion in the Covenant Archive's secured frequency band, like a whisper where silence was law. I remember pausing mid-annotation, my tendrils still hovering above the holoscript, when the waveform pulsed again. Unauthorized. Impossible. Human transmissions were not supposed to reach us. Their technology, by our assessments, lagged centuries behind interstellar diplomatic standards. And yet there it was, clean, stable, layered with encryption protocols I had only seen in ancient military relics. I felt a tightening in my thorax, a primitive response I thought my species had evolved beyond. The voice that followed was calm, too calm. This is a formal warning. No plea, no introduction, no appeal to law or mercy. Around me, senior archivists gathered, their bioluminescent markings dimming in unease. Humans were known to be volatile, fractured by internal wars, driven by emotion, prone to collapse under sustained pressure. That was the consensus. That was what we taught. But nothing in that voice matched the profile. The transmission repeated itself across multiple systems, hopping relays with surgical precision. Each replay sharpened the sense that this message was not meant for us alone, but for something else listening in the dark. The human speaker named the Ashen Fang. At that name, the chamber chilled. The Ashen Fang were not conquerors. They were parasites. They specialized in terror, seizing fledgling civilizations, broadcasting suffering until ransoms were paid or entire cultures broke. Even the Council negotiated with them, especially the Council. Yet the human voice did not negotiate. "You are in violation of human jurisdiction," it said. A murmur rippled through the archive. Jurisdiction? Humans were not signatories of the Galactic Accords. They held no recognized authority beyond their own contested borders.
To claim otherwise was either ignorance or audacity on a scale I could barely comprehend. I replayed the audio, isolating micro-inflections, searching for emotional spikes. Anger, fear, desperation. There were none. What I found instead was restraint, measured pacing, controlled breath. The sound of a species that had already decided what would happen next. For the first time in my academic career, I felt dread, not of the Ashen Fang, but of the humans addressing them. In the Covenant Archive, restraint is a prelude. Every recorded extinction, every sanctioned purge, began not with threats, but with warnings, delivered calmly, efficiently, and without hope of reversal. The signal ended with coordinates and a time marker. 12 standard hours. As the waveform collapsed into silence, I realized the most terrifying detail of all. The humans had not asked for our attention. They had assumed it. And somewhere beyond our charts, something was about to learn what that assumption meant. The High Council demanded context, not concern. Fear, they said, was a failure of scholarship. So I was ordered to compile what we knew of humanity. Nothing more than a historical footnote, a comparative study to reassure the chamber that no laws of the galaxy had been broken. I began with their world. Earth was classified as a death world long before humans ever reached orbit. Violent climate oscillations, unstable tectonic plates that tore continents apart. Predators evolved not merely to hunt, but to pursue. Even their star was temperamental, bathing the planet in radiation bursts that should have erased complex life again and again. And yet, humans endured. Their records were not songs of balance or unity. They were chronicles of resistance, ice ages, plagues, impacts from the sky. Each event should have ended them. Instead, each became a lesson. They adapted faster than extinction could claim them, bending biology, tools, and eventually entire ecosystems to their will.
What unsettled me most was not their resilience, but their relationship with pain. Other species evolved to avoid it. Humans analyzed it, measured it, pushed against it deliberately, as if testing how much suffering could be endured without breaking. Their physiology reflected this obsession. Redundant organs, accelerated healing, neural systems capable of functioning through catastrophic injury. Then I reached their wars. These conflicts predated planetary unity, Chaotic, unregulated, fought with crude weapons that turned cities into ash. The casualty numbers were obscene by council standards. Millions lost, entire generations erased. And yet, there was no record of surrender that ended a people, only pauses, regroupings, returns. They rebuilt endlessly. After every collapse, their civilizations rose again, sharper, more technologically ruthless. Even their art betrayed them. Stories of last stands, doomed defenders, individuals holding the line against impossible odds. Their heroes were not those who survived unscathed, but those who endured when survival itself seemed unreasonable. I presented my findings to the council. They dismissed them within minutes. Barbarism does not equal strength, one elder declared. Endurance without harmony leads only to self-destruction. Others agreed. Humans, they concluded, were dangerous to themselves, not to the galaxy. I wanted to believe them. Then I accessed restricted Ashen Fang archives, data seized from prior negotiations, flagged as irrelevant. What I found made my bioluminescence dim to a sickly hue. Multiple incursions into human-controlled space, classified failures, entire terror fleets lost without engagement records, no ransom demands logged, no negotiation attempts recorded. Ships vanished, crews erased, infrastructure wiped clean with methodical precision. I searched for errors. There were none. The Ashen Fang had not been defeated publicly. They had been removed, quietly, efficiently.
As if their existence had been corrected rather than contested. One file contained a single notation from an Ashen Fang strategist, recovered from a black box fragment. Humans do not respond to terror as expected. That was all. No details, no after-action analysis, just absence, silence. I closed the archive and understood, at last, what the council could not. Humans do not survive because they are peaceful. They do not endure because they seek harmony. They survive because they refuse to lose. And now, with a warning already issued and a deadline already set, that refusal was no longer confined to their own world. It was about to become the galaxy's problem. The human envoy arrived without escort. No honor guard, no ceremonial shielding, no visible weapons, just a single human figure standing at the center of the council chamber, dwarfed by architecture designed to intimidate lesser species. They did not bow, they did not request permission to speak. They simply waited, still, patient, as if the delay itself were inconsequential. That, more than anything, unsettled me. When the council finally acknowledged them, the humans stepped forward. Their posture was relaxed. Their pulse, according to my scanner, was steady. This was not bravado. It was certainty. "Return the hostages," the envoy said. A pause, deliberate. "Leave the system." Another pause. "You have 12 standard hours." No legal citations, no emotional appeal, no attempt at persuasion. For a fraction of a cycle, the chamber was silent. Then disbelief erupted in layered frequencies: outrage, laughter, alarm. Negotiation protocols were older than most civilizations present. Even apex predators bargained when stakes were high enough. The idea that an unaligned species would issue an ultimatum to the Ashen Fang was absurd. The terrorists themselves responded within minutes.
They hijacked public relays, flooding the network with images of captive colonies, families restrained, atmospheric processors sabotaged, countdowns ticking toward irreversible collapse. Their message was clear: comply or watch entire cultures suffocate. This was the moment where fear usually entered the equation. The humans said nothing. No counterstatement, no revision, no extension of the deadline. 12 hours passed like a held breath. Then, space folded. Human fleets emerged across the contested system with precision that defied our models. Not a chaotic surge, but synchronized arrivals at tactically impossible angles. There were no warning shots, no attempts at communication. The Ashen Fang's command nodes went dark one by one, their transmission arrays silenced before distress calls could propagate. What followed was not battle. It was dismantling.
Life support systems in terrorist strongholds were selectively shut down, oxygen levels reduced only in compartments occupied by combatants. Power grids collapsed in cascading patterns designed to isolate resistance cells while keeping civilian habitats intact. Every strike was measured, every action calculated to the smallest margin. I watched, transfixed, as an entire terror network unraveled in real time. No explosions for spectacle, no pursuit fueled by rage, just relentless execution of a plan written long before the first ship arrived. Within hours, the hostages were recovered, alive, shaken, but breathing. The Ashen Fang ceased to exist, not defeated, not driven off, but erased as an organization. Their symbols vanished from the net, their cells went silent. Their allies disavowed them in a panic that spread faster than any plague. When it was over, the human envoy returned to the council chamber. They looked unchanged. No triumph, no satisfaction. This was not retaliation, they said, meeting the gaze of beings who had ruled by negotiation for millennia. This was policy.
I understood then that we had made a catastrophic miscalculation. We had assumed negotiation was a universal instinct, that survival required dialogue, that terror could always be leveraged. Humans had evolved past that assumption. They did not negotiate with terrorists, not because they lacked mercy, but because mercy, to them, came after certainty, after the threat was gone, after the innocent were safe. As the envoy departed, a single realization echoed through the chamber, heavy and irreversible. The galaxy had just witnessed a warning, not a demonstration. And warnings, when issued by humans, are never repeated. The Ashen Fang believed they understood terror. Their archives were meticulous, centuries of psychological profiling, behavioral matrices compiled from hundreds of subjugated species. They knew how fear fractured societies, how panic disrupted command structures, how desperation forced negotiations long before annihilation became necessary. Humans were supposed to be no different. The survivor logs told a different story. I accessed them after the network collapse, fragments recovered from black boxes drifting through dead space. What I found chilled me more than any battlefield footage. The Ashen Fang did not describe rage or chaos. They described confusion. Captured human operatives did not beg. They did not bargain. Under interrogation, they triggered failsafes embedded so deeply that even neural torture could not prevent activation. Entire data caches erased themselves mid-sentence. Some operatives accepted fatal neural overload rather than allow extraction. The logs recorded this as abnormal loyalty. I recognized it as discipline. More disturbing still were the civilian responses. When terror broadcasts reached human worlds, images engineered to induce hysteria, the expected collapse never came. Instead, evacuation protocols initiated within minutes, not government-mandated chaos, but coordinated motion. Transit lanes cleared. Emergency shelters filled to optimal capacity. Medical triage systems activated without instruction. Entire cities moved as a single organism. The Ashen Fang commanders interpreted the silence as weakness. No riots, no pleas transmitted to the council, no public demands for negotiation. They concluded that humans were in shock, that fear had rendered them passive. That was the miscalculation. The calm was not surrender. It was preparation. When the counteroffensive began, it unfolded with mechanical inevitability. Humans exploited environmental variables we had long considered too unstable to weaponize. They adjusted orbital mechanics, redirecting debris fields into kinetic bombardments timed to microseconds. They used planetary magnetospheres to scramble enemy sensors, then struck from blind angles no simulation had predicted. There was no fury in their tactics, no excessive force. Every strike had purpose. Supply depots disabled first, communication relays next, command vessels last, isolated, surrounded, suffocated by precision rather than fire. The Ashen Fang logs grew frantic near the end. "They do not pursue fleeing units," one commander wrote. "They advance only where resistance remains." Another entry followed moments later. "They are dismantling us, systematically." The final transmission came from a high-ranking strategist, broadcast across every remaining channel in a desperate attempt to warn Allied cells. "They are not hunting us," the message said, its signal breaking under interference. "They are correcting an error." Then silence. That sentence propagated farther than any terror broadcast ever had. Military analysts across the galaxy seized upon it, dissected it, replayed it in academies and war rooms. The implication was horrifying. Humans did not view the Ashen Fang as enemies in a conflict. They viewed them as a malfunction, something to be fixed. In council chambers, doctrines were quietly rewritten. Assumptions about deterrence, escalation, and negotiation were amended with new clauses, human clauses. Entire strategies based on fear compliance were abandoned overnight. As for me, I archived the survivor logs under a new classification, one that had never existed before. Species response, non-negotiable. Because the Ashen Fang had not lost a war, they had triggered a correction. And as I reviewed the expanding reach of human fleets repositioning across nearby systems, not advancing, merely standing ready, I understood the final miscalculation was not tactical. The terrorists had assumed humans could be frightened into restraint. They had mistaken calm for weakness. And now the galaxy was left to reckon with what happens when fear no longer works. The galaxy did not panic immediately. First came hesitation, an uneasy pause as systems recalibrated around a new reality. Then came fear, refined into policy. The High Council convened an emergency session, not to condemn the Ashen Fang, they were already gone, but to address what they now perceived as a greater danger: humanity. I was present when the first intervention motion was drafted. The language was careful, ceremonial, wrapped in centuries of precedent. Sanctions, trade limitations, diplomatic restrictions, the tools we used whenever a species demonstrated what the Council called excessive unilateral force. Diplomatic fleets were dispatched to human-controlled space, their hulls polished, their banners glowing with the authority of galactic law. Legal threats followed, formal declarations citing violations of escalation protocols, warnings of isolation should humans repeat such actions. The humans received them. Politely. Their representatives stood before us once more, posture unchanged, expression unreadable by our standards. They listened without interruption as accusations were read aloud, as projections detailed hypothetical futures of galactic instability, arms races, cascading violence.
When the final charge was delivered, the chamber waited for outrage. Instead, the human asked a single question: "May we present our records?" Data flooded the chamber. Every Ashen Fang operation interrupted, time-stamped, geolocated, verified by third-party observation. Every hostage extracted alive, every civilian casualty avoided. Statistical models demonstrated reduced long-term conflict probabilities across 17 neighboring systems. Then came the legal analysis. The humans had obeyed every explicit law. They had not invaded sovereign territory. They had not targeted non-combatants. They had not ignored council mandates, because none had been issued in time. Their actions existed entirely within legal margins we had never bothered to define. Gray zones. We had assumed those spaces would never be used. No species ever had. What unsettled me most was the moral framework embedded in the data. Humans had deliberately accepted higher operational risk to minimize collateral damage. They had delayed strikes to allow evacuations, sometimes losing tactical advantages as a result. They had calculated not just victory, but aftermath. This was not recklessness. It was rigidity, a form of moral inflexibility that allowed no compromise where civilians were concerned, and no patience where terror was used as leverage. The human representative let the silence stretch after the presentation ended. "Your laws," they said at last, their voice steady, "are designed for negotiation." A pause. "Ours are designed for survival." The words settled heavily over the chamber. For the first time, I sensed uncertainty among the elders, not moral disagreement, but strategic fear. If the council pressed further, it would not be enforcing order. It would be challenging a species whose definition of order did not rely on consent. The motion to sanction humanity was put to vote, unanimously withdrawn. Not because the council approved of what the humans had done, not because we trusted them,
But because we understood something then, something no data projection could soften. The humans had demonstrated that they could operate within our laws while rendering them irrelevant, that they could dismantle threats faster than our committees could convene, that escalation to them was not an emotional reaction, but a calculated necessity. As the session adjourned, I recorded the decision in the archives. Officially, it was listed as a diplomatic reconsideration. Privately, every being in that chamber knew the truth. The council had blinked. And in the vacuum that followed, a new balance began to form. Not one maintained by treaties and negotiations, but by the unspoken understanding that some species would act when others hesitated. As the human fleets remained stationary at the edge of monitored space, not advancing, not retreating, I felt a deep, unsettled clarity. The Council had tried to intervene, and discovered, too late, that intervention only works when both sides fear the consequences. Humans did not. For many cycles after the Ashen Fang's collapse, the word most frequently spoken in council chambers was mercy. It was spoken with accusation. They showed none, some said. They went too far, others insisted. A species without mercy cannot be trusted. I believed this at first, or perhaps I wanted to. It was easier to label humans as cruel than to accept the alternative, that their actions followed a logic colder and far more disciplined than our own. Then the trials began. Not executions, not disappearances, trials. Captured Ashen Fang operatives were transferred to human custody under tightly controlled conditions. Observers were permitted. I was assigned as one of them, my role purely archival. I expected efficiency bordering on brutality. What I witnessed unsettled me in a different way. The proceedings were meticulous.
Every charge was supported by layered evidence, sensor logs, victim testimony, internal Ashen Fang communications recovered from data fragments we believed unrecoverable. Humans reconstructed entire command hierarchies from digital ash. No accusation was made without proof, no verdict reached without verification. The accused were allowed to speak. This, more than anything, surprised the Council. The Ashen Fang had broadcast suffering across the galaxy. They had weaponized fear. And yet, here they were, permitted to explain themselves before judgment. None of it mattered, not because the humans ignored their words, but because the outcomes had already been measured against one immutable standard. Had harm been inflicted on the innocent? If the answer was yes, the sentence was final. There was no spectacle, no public satisfaction. Punishments were delivered privately, efficiently, without celebration or cruelty. Entire terror cells were dismantled not as warnings, but as closures, endpoints to equations already solved. I reviewed the sentencing data. It revealed a pattern that chilled me. Humans did not escalate punishment to deter future threats. They applied exactly what was required to ensure the threat could never recur, no more, no less. Other species called it cold. I watched an Ashen Fang commander, responsible for the slow suffocation of an agricultural moon, hear their verdict without protest. Perhaps they sensed what I did then. This was not vengeance, it was accounting. Mercy, in human doctrine, was not extended in uncertainty. It did not exist during deliberation or conflict. It arrived only after certainty, after evidence was complete, after the threat was neutralized, after no variable remained unresolved. Only then did mercy appear. Survivors were spared. Lesser accomplices were imprisoned rather than executed. Rehabilitation programs were offered, not as forgiveness, but as prevention. Humans invested resources into ensuring that the conditions which birthed terror would not do so again. That was the part no one discussed. Mercy was not absent, it was delayed. To my people, mercy is instinctive, often offered too early, in hopes it will end conflict before it begins. To humans, early mercy is a risk variable, a gamble with innocent lives. They refuse to gamble. As these realizations spread, fear in the Council evolved into something quieter. Respect, perhaps, or caution sharpened by understanding. Military observers revised threat models. Philosophers rewrote ethical frameworks. Diplomats struggled to translate a morality that did not bend under emotional pressure. As for me, I amended the archive classification. Not ruthless species, not predatory civilization. Instead, I wrote, conditional mercy applied post-neutralization. Terrifyingly fair. And yet, as human detention facilities closed one by one because there were no prisoners left to process, I noticed something else. Human fleets were not disbanding, they were repositioning, monitoring new sectors, adjusting to threats not yet visible. Mercy, I realized, had limits, and certainty once achieved did not end their vigilance, it sharpened it. Somewhere beyond the Council's charts, probability curves were shifting again, and I feared we were about to learn what humans did before mercy, when certainty had not yet been reached. Change did not announce itself with ceremony. It crept through the galaxy in revisions, footnotes, and quiet deletions. I noticed it first in the academies. Curricula that had remained untouched for millennia were suddenly marked under review,
Strategic models based on deterrence through negotiation were archived. Case studies once considered theoretical curiosities were elevated to mandatory instruction. The catalyst was always the same: human response patterns. Military instructors replayed the Ashen Fang collapse frame by frame, not as a victory, but as a lesson in inevitability. The absence of escalation rhetoric baffled tacticians. Humans had not threatened retaliation. They had demonstrated consequence. That distinction alone rendered half our doctrines obsolete. Students asked a question I had never heard before. How do we avoid triggering them? Across the darker channels of the network, the effect was even more pronounced. Terrorist cells went silent, not dormant, disbanded. Assets liquidated. Commanders vanished into obscurity. Entire organizations dissolved without a single human ship entering their sectors. Fear had always been a tool of terror. Now fear belonged to the terrorists. Intercepted communications revealed frantic reassessments. Species that once relied on hostage leverage now considered it a death sentence. Negotiation strategies were rewritten to remove civilian coercion entirely. Even threats became measured, cautious, almost apologetic. Entire regions stabilized. Not through peace treaties, not through council arbitration, but through absence of broadcasts, of ultimatums, of calculated cruelty. Trade routes reopened where extortion once thrived. Border systems reported the lowest violence indices in recorded history. The variable that changed was not law, it was probability. Humanity introduced a constant into equations long governed by uncertainty. Where terror once carried a chance of success, however small, it now carried a near certainty of erasure. Analysts struggled to quantify it. Philosophers debated whether fear-induced peace could be called peace at all. But statistics are indifferent to philosophy. Incidents declined. Casualties dropped. Entire species slept without emergency alerts for the first time in generations. And yet, unease lingered. Because deterrence built on fear is brittle, it works only so long as the threat remains credible. Humans understood this. They did not posture. They did not patrol aggressively. Their fleets remained just visible enough, present but not provocative. A reminder, not a menace. I attended a closed symposium where senior strategists admitted what no public statement would ever record. The Galaxy had outsourced its enforcement of non-negotiable norms to a species that never asked for the role. One analyst phrased it bluntly: if they ever stop caring, we are all in danger. That was the paradox. Human presence reduced violence everywhere, except in projections of worst-case futures. Their existence compressed timelines. Conflicts that might once have dragged on for decades were now resolved in moments or abandoned entirely. Probability curves bent around them. I updated the archives again, adding a new classification under Galactic constants: human intervention threshold, defined not by territory but by behavior. Harm the defenseless, weaponize fear. Cross that line, and the response was no longer theoretical. As I finalized the entry, a notification flickered across my console. Unconfirmed reports of a new extremist faction forming at the edge of mapped space. Their doctrine rejected deterrence itself. They claimed the humans were a myth, an exaggeration, a temporary anomaly. I felt a familiar tightening in my thorax. The Galaxy had rewritten its playbook, yes, but there are always those who refuse to read the new rules. And somewhere, beyond the reach of our revised doctrines, probability was about to be tested again, not by the Galaxy, but by humans deciding whether intervention was necessary at all. I did not plan to ask the question. It formed slowly, an accumulation of unease rather than curiosity. After cycles of observation, of doctrines rewritten, of terror networks dissolving, of entire regions settling into an unfamiliar quiet, I realized there was a variable no model accounted for. Why? Not how humans fought, not when they intervened, but why they shouldered a burden no one had assigned them.
The opportunity came during a post-operation review aboard a human command vessel. The ship was unadorned, functional to the point of austerity. No trophies, no victory markings,
just corridors worn smooth by use. I was escorted by an officer whose rank insignia I could not decipher, another reminder that humans did not broadcast hierarchy unless necessary. We paused near a viewport. Beyond it, a star burned steadily, indifferent to the lives once threatened nearby. "Why did you go so far?" I asked at last. "The council would have negotiated. It would have been slower, but safer for you." The human did not answer immediately. They watched the star, as if weighing something invisible. "Because someone has to," they said. The simplicity of the response unsettled me more than any tactical display. No grand philosophy, no declaration of moral superiority, just inevitability, spoken as fact. They explained, in fragments rather than speeches. Humans did not see themselves as guardians of space or enforcers of law. They did not intervene for territory, resources, or influence. Most human worlds, they admitted, would never even know what had been prevented. They intervened because fear, once allowed to rule the innocent, spread faster than any weapon. "Terror works by teaching people they are alone," the human said. "We know what that does to a society." I accessed human historical parallels later. Genocides enabled by silence. Atrocities ignored because they occurred beyond convenient borders. Again and again, humans had learned the same lesson at staggering cost. If no one acts, fear wins by default. What they were protecting was not peace. It was agency. The right of civilians to live without being used as leverage. The right of cultures to exist without calculating how much suffering would buy their survival. Humans considered that line, weaponized innocence, non-negotiable. That, I realized, was why their responses were so absolute. Negotiation implied legitimacy.
Delay implied tolerance, and tolerance to humans was indistinguishable from permission. They had drawn a boundary and burned it into their doctrine. As I prepared to depart the vessel, the human officer added something almost as an afterthought. "We don't expect gratitude," they said, "and we don't expect everyone to agree with us." I asked what they expected then. They met my gaze, a rare gesture of directness. "That if you see it happening," they said, "you don't look away." The words followed me back to the archive. For the first time, I reframed human intervention not as domination, but as refusal, the refusal to accept a universe where fear dictated terms. It was not altruism, it was memory, a species shaped by its own failures choosing not to repeat them at scale. As I logged the encounter, another alert surfaced, confirmation of the extremist faction I had seen referenced days earlier. Their manifesto rejected deterrence, dismissed human resolve as theatrical. I closed the file slowly. Humans were not protecting territory, they were protecting a principle, and principles, once defended without compromise, tend to attract those who wish to test them. The galaxy was about to learn whether this one would bend or break everything that pressed against it. The silence was what I noticed first. Not the absence of explosions or the end of broadcasts, those were measurable, expected. It was the deeper quiet, the kind that settles only when a system has stopped bracing for impact. No emergency pings spiked across the net, no priority alerts forced their way into my console. For the first time in centuries of recorded cycles, the hostage index read 0. 0. Terror channels went dark one by one, not in defiance, but in abandonment. The looping images of suffering vanished, replaced by static and forgotten identifiers. Analysts waited for the faint, for the resurgence, the inevitable next demand. It never came.
Trade routes reopened cautiously at first, escorted by redundant security and layered insurance. Then confidence grew. Convoys lengthened. Insurance premiums dropped. Civilian vessels began traveling without armed escorts, a sight so unfamiliar it drew crowds to observation decks. I watched one such convoy pass through a former choke point, an asteroid corridor once infamous for disappearances. The ships moved unhurriedly, their transponders broadcasting nothing more than cargo manifests and arrival times. No distress signals followed. Entire regions stabilized. Worlds that had lived under the constant arithmetic of fear, how many lives could be spared, how much suffering could be delayed, began to plan again, not contingencies, futures. Agricultural cycles extended beyond emergency rations. Education networks restored curricula that had been paused for generations. The Council issued a statement, careful in its wording. It credited collective deterrence and renewed commitment to galactic law. No species was named, no actions acknowledged. Everyone knew better. Peace had arrived, but it had not been negotiated into existence. It had been enforced, quietly, decisively, without spectacle. The absence of terror was not the result of compromise, but of calculation. The cost of terror had finally exceeded its benefit. In private briefings, strategists admitted what public doctrine could not. The humans had altered the risk landscape so completely that terror was no longer a viable strategy. Not difficult, not dangerous, impossible. I walked the upper galleries of the archive, past holograms of extinct cultures preserved as cautionary exhibits. For once, no new additions were projected. Preservation, it seemed, was finally outpacing destruction. And yet, beneath the relief, unease persisted. Peace enforced by deterrence is fragile. It depends on memory, on the belief that the consequence will come again if tested.
As cycles passed without incident, I began to wonder how long that memory would last. How long before complacency dulled fear's edge? How long before someone convinced themselves that humans had grown tired, that they would hesitate next time? Because enforced peace does not feel like peace to everyone. Some species thrived in the vacuum left by Terra's absence. Others resented it. Extremists whispered that the galaxy had traded one form of domination for another, that safety bought through fear was still fear, just redirected. I logged these dissenting signals carefully. Patterns matter. On the day the last Terra broadcast was officially declared inactive, I received a restricted update. Fleet movements beyond standard monitoring zones. Human ships repositioning again. Not massing, not retreating. Adjusting. The galaxy felt safe that day. I felt it too, a loosening I had not realized I carried. But safety, I had learned, was not a permanent state. It was a condition maintained. As I closed the daily archive, a final notation appeared. Unverified intelligence, flagged low priority by automated systems. A rumor of coordination among fringe actors. Nothing actionable, nothing urgent. I stared at it longer than protocol required. Peace had arrived. And somewhere, inevitably, someone was already preparing to test whether it would be allowed to stay. I filed the human message in the deepest vault of the Covenant archive, under a category few had ever accessed, Galactic warnings, non-negotiable. The data was sparse, not a protocol, not a manifesto, just coordinates, timestamps, and a phrase repeated for clarity across countless channels. If you harm the defenseless, we will come. No flourish, no embellishment, no speeches about justice, retaliation, or glory. Just certainty. A single conditional, absolute, irrefutable. I replayed the message a dozen times, isolating every inflection, every pause. No emotion leaked. Not rage, not pride, not malice.
Just clarity. A message delivered as if the sender knew the universe itself would obey. I recorded the reactions from other species. Confusion, curiosity, awe, fear. Analysts speculated endlessly. Was it bluff? Were the humans exaggerating their capabilities? The questions circulated faster than data packets, yet no one could find evidence of deception. No Ashen Fang cells remained to challenge it. No conflicts had escalated since. Even the Council hesitated. No declaration could supersede it. No treaty could mitigate it. It existed outside precedent, outside diplomacy. The phrase alone reshaped interstellar behavior. I studied civilian channels. News networks, trading posts, and civilian archives transmitted it wordlessly. Children across multiple systems repeated it as rhyme. Teachers cautioned students with it. Merchants whispered it in marketplaces. Across languages and planets, the same 3 warnings repeated, etched into culture rather than law. I realized then that the humans had done something extraordinary. They had delivered an ultimatum without threatening war, without performing a single violent act in the message itself, and yet the galaxy had accepted it as law. No fleets moved against them, no governments disputed it. Even those who had resisted human authority silently deferred, assuming observation, calculation, inevitability. The warning was now permanent, immutable, a rule not enforced by guns, shields, or fleets, but by expectation, history, and certainty. I closed the archive terminal. Outside, stars blinked indifferently. The Ashen Fang had disappeared, extremist cells retracted, trade stabilized, civilizations breathed without counting the cost of terror. And somewhere, in the vast indifferent black, humans watched, waiting, not for glory, not for acknowledgement, but for the inevitable transgression that would test the rule. The galaxy, for once, believed. And for a fleeting cycle, I allowed myself to hope that belief might hold.
Until someone, somewhere, decided to test it.